And now, the survival show that once survived building a gun with a 12-ton press and a hammer, fingers intact. In this episode, we welcome on Arthur Bradley. He's an author and NASA engineer, a real one, not like the sort of nonsense Jonathan, Jason, and I used to tell women. Howdy and welcome to In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 247. I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole. Safe and sound. A quick note before we get into this episode. It seems episode number 246 really resonated with some people, quite a few people actually. One listener even said it felt like old school ITH days. There was passion, there was fury, while staying just this side of a rant. Hey, we're a family here, and I do listen to y'all. The show is just for you, after all. So, I will take the feedback and start making more episodes like 246. You can always comment on an episode via the site, or even to a lesser degree on the Facebook post when the episode comes out. And I will use your great thoughts to make the show better, or as a topic for an episode. Anyway, great guest today, and a very unusual, heartwarming $100 answer. Let's bring him on. Arthur, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
Thank you for having me.
So this is fun because you are not only a prepper author, so to speak, you're also a NASA engineer. So you come at things from perhaps a different way than most people as far as how methodical you are in your research and fact checking.
Yeah, when I first started out writing books, that was actually my sort of driving purpose, was to try and create some really factually accurate information. And so, you know, like a lot of people, I buy all of the various how-to books on preparedness and survival, and I've found a lot of, discrepancies and conflicting information. And so I've tried to lend an honest, sort of technically accurate hand to my writing, and hopefully people have seen that throughout the years.
Mm-hmm. So now is it 11 books that you are the author of?
It is actually 14 books.
Oh, wow. Okay. 14 books. And several of those are also nonfiction books as well as an entire fiction series.
Right. Yeah. 4 of them are nonfiction books.
Well, cool. So this is a book club episode. We'll be focusing on the fiction series today, the Survivalist series. Before we get into that, let's get to know you a little bit better, Arthur. How did you get into preparedness? What lit the fire for you?
Well, it probably, like a lot of people, I grew up around emergency preparedness and survivalism, just a sort of ancillary way. My dad was a Marine, and, I remember being a child. I share this story with people, but I remember being a child, and we would sit around the dinner tables and study these bomb blast maps where they used to print these maps that showed the likely impact areas of all these nuclear weapons and so forth. That was back in the days of the Cold War, and there was a lot of concern, a lot of bunkers and stuff. And so I sort of grew up through that generation of worrying about nuclear war, and it sort of led to sort of this general preparedness philosophy. I was a Boy Scout for a long time. My dad was a big Eagle Scout. And so I kind of came up in a family where, be ready and be prepared were just sort of mantras that we lived with. But I will say, and then I went in the Army, airborne infantry guy. And as I came out of that, that much tougher, that much a little bit more experienced on things. I got married and had kids, and it wasn't until really the attack on the Twin Towers that I really started to assess my readiness level. I remember that day. I'm sure many, many people do. Mm-hmm. And I was at work that day, and we were watching it on television. And I just remember standing there, in a friend's doorway, wondering what that meant. What does that mean to me and my family? Is the world just changing right before my eyes? And, are we ready for that change? And it ended up, of course, the world kind of settled after a period of time. But it did make me really start turning an eye towards getting really prepared and ready for the kinds of things that might come our way, and so that we could survive it. And so, I jumped into every preparedness book ever written and scoured them, pulled facts, pulled details, tried all kinds of things, and then decided I would put together my own manual of the things I thought that were most important.
I gotcha. So how did you come to writing? Was it just you trying to, like you said, put that manual together, or was it something that you started off as a kid, you were into creative writing, and then came back to it again as an adult? How did that work for you?
Yeah, it's a strange life is such a strange sort of cycle. When I was a kid, I was very much of a creative writing sort of person. We wrote short stories. I remember being in junior high school and high school and writing these, very colorful short stories and reading all of this fantasy fiction and various things. And, Edgar Rice Burroughs, the Martian Chronicles and all those things, John Carter and all that stuff. And loved that stuff, right? And a lot of creativity in that. And then that time sort of passed. And then later, I guess it was probably in 2000, maybe in early 2000s or late 1990s, I tried my hand at writing a novel. And so that novel is called Process of Elimination. And, it took me a couple of years. I didn't know what I was doing. But, at the end, I was pretty proud of it. And I published that novel. And then I got really interested again because of the Twin Tower attacks and preparedness. I thought, well, I'm going to do something more. I've written a lot of technical papers over the years as an engineer. I thought, I'm going to write something a little more technical and, meaty that makes, good logical sense to people. And so I wrote my first edition of that handbook, and it really was more of like a guide. And then after those were so successful, I'd written a few nonfiction books. I thought, well, I really want to turn my hand back to trying to create this fictional world where I can tell stories. And that led me to the Survivalist series.
Okay. So and this may shed some light also on the series, what is your personal disaster? What is the thing that keeps you up at night? What are you personally most passionate about? Well,
so the Survivalist series certainly captures one of them. It's about a pandemic that spreads across the globe and kills most of the people. And that's certainly one I think that's a very real, certainly in my top few things that I think that could fundamentally change the world is some kind of global pandemic. I think we're a sneeze away from that, pun intended. But nuclear war, I think, is certainly another one. Certainly lately with the North Korea and the Russian and the Chinese, and there's a lot of pressure, it seems like, building where, the one that used to be the topic of nuclear weapons was it's never going to happen. Nobody's going to use them. I don't feel that way anymore. I certainly feel like it's on the table. And so that whole concept of a nuclear war of some sort coming about would be probably my other biggest concern.
I gotcha. To come back to the writing for a second, what author or authors inspired you? You named some a moment ago, but are there more recent that you look to for style and voice or some sort of other inspiration?
Yeah, so I would say in terms of nonfiction, there were many. I read just about every nonfiction book out. I liked Cody London's style, sort of his practical style of writing preparedness stuff. I think his are some of the better books out there. There are some I don't like, which are very popular, but I won't mention them because they really just they just don't seem to have much information in them when you really look at them. In terms of fiction, I don't read survivalist fiction, believe it or not.
Okay.
And I do that intentionally. And I love survivalist fiction, but I don't read it because I don't want to inadvertently pull from it, you know? And so I've got this series that I'm writing, and I don't want to accidentally bleed other people's ideas into it. So for a period of the last 5 years or more, I really haven't read any, prep or survivalist fiction at all. I'm sure there's a lot of great stuff out there, and I get, people reference them all the time to me. But I've sort of put them on my shelf and said, I'm not going to read those until I'm done because I don't want to accidentally draw from it.
I know exactly what you mean. I run into the same situation. It gets tricky because you're like, oh, wait, did I think of that, or did somebody else think of that? And I just read it somewhere a year ago. What are your non-prepper fiction books that you're really into?
Just sort of mainstream type books would be like Dean Koontz. I love Dean Koontz writing. I sort of grew up reading just about everything he's written over the years. I like a lot of general, even Stephen King. I like Stephen King. I'm a pretty generalized sort of guy in terms of reading. And I'd be honest with you, since I've started writing fiction, I don't read a lot. I wish I could read more because I'm always busy either working, taking care of the family, or writing. And it's sort of like I have these three different things going on. And so it's difficult to find too much time to stay current on all of the reading.
Yeah. So when you write, are you just trying to tell a good story in the genre that you're passionate about and some lessons get mixed in? Or are you really trying to teach something and the story is the vehicle, since it is the oldest way of communicating ideas and information?
Yeah, so I had to answer that question on the very first day I set out writing, because I do have a lot of knowledge about survival and preparedness in general. And so I tried to decide, do I want this to be more about a teaching book and with a story rolled in, or more of a story with a little bit of teaching rolled in? And I went with the latter. I thought, you know what I really love reading is a good adventure story. And that's what I wanted to write. And so I sat down and said, I'm going to just write a really fun, action-packed story with what I hoped were, not only an interesting storyline, but characters that people felt like, were real people that they cared about. And that's what I set out to write. Now, along the way, as I have characters in the book going through all these various challenges, I of course, try and apply these sort of survival and preparedness mentality. What would I do in this situation? What could they do? And put a lot of different teaching moments throughout the books, but only in a way that never detracts from the story. At least that's always been my intent.
Okay, so walk us into the books. How does the series start?
Yeah, so the series right now, there are 10 books currently out. They're just the overall series called The Survivalist. The very first book is called Frontier Justice. And then each of the titles has some kind of little hint of what the story's about, but it's not always obvious. And in this case, the story starts off with a U.S. Marshal, and his name's Mason Raines. And he essentially goes up to his cabin up in the Blue Ridge Mountains to get away from it all for a while. And the world being what it is, while he's there, an outbreak of this pandemic occurs. It's actually an intentional release by a microbiologist who actually infects himself and goes to a virologist conference and infects all the other virologists all over the world, and sort of spreads it, globally by the people most qualified to actually combat it.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, what a crazy idea, right? And so anyway, so you sort of wipe out the people who have the ability to kind of stop it. And by the time this marshal comes out of the mountains and, sort of heads on back into town, the world is fundamentally sort of changed. And most of the first book is focused on two different storylines. One is his story. He ends up encountering an Irish wolfhound that's sort of been trapped in a building for a period of time and rescues the dog. And so they become a pair, and they go on their adventure throughout that story, which is sort of centered in Boone, North Carolina, which is a neat little town in North Carolina. I've been there a few times, and it's a very neat little place. And then the other story, so there's always two stories going at once. The other story is of his father, a guy named Tanner Raines. And Tanner Raines is in prison at the time that the outbreak breaks out. He's a sort of a violent, rough and tough sort of guy who you find out later why he's in prison, but he sort of took his own personal vengeance on some people that did something that they shouldn't have. And anyway, he manages to get out of prison because of a favor he did someone. And so that story, the second half of the story, follows him. He meets up with a young girl who ends up being the president's daughter. She's involved in a helicopter crash, and he sort of saves her, and they become traveling companions as sort of the unlikeliest of pair. And so these two stories sort of go side by side, alternating one chapter after the other, and you sort of follow along their storyline.
We'll be back after this quick break. Listener, do you get at least $3 a month worth of value out of ITH? You should see what we do for the Roving Horde Armada members. Check it out today by visiting ITH.net. Members get access to episodes a day early, access to monthly virtual and in-person meetups in some areas, an invitation to the secret ITH Armada Facebook group so you can chat about survival all day long with like-minded people, access to every episode ever produced by ITH. That's right, all the way back to the beginning, including one that was never aired. And those are just a few things you get with your membership when you sign up and become part of the ITH Roving Horde by going to ITH.net. Again, that's ITH.net. So, as an electrical engineer, why did you choose the pandemic instead of, say, writing an EMP series?
Yeah, and I know a great deal about EMPs, having written a book on that subject. But there's been a lot of fiction written, some very good, I guess, on EMP events. Dr. Forshin's book, I think everybody knows 1 Second After. I certainly read that book. And so there's been some fiction on that already. And I thought, well, I don't want to throw my hat in the same ring as everybody else. I want to write something a little bit different. And, an EMP event would have, or even a solar storm event would have an impact on the world, but it's not the same impact as if, a microbiologist gets a release of an agent that kills 99% of anybody that it infects. And so I opted for that, where there's lots of dead bodies and and there's some mutations occur. I sort of go into the realm a little bit outside of maybe what's realistic, but to have some fun with it, and so I'm able to do that with this.
Very neat, very neat. So how do you keep these fresh? Because a series is hard to do and keep it good, consistently good. How do you? I mean, that's got to be a struggle. Tell us about that.
Oh yeah, you're right. I think that's the hardest part. Now, I didn't set out to write a long series. I set out to maybe write a handful of books. And I had the storyline in mind from the beginning, sort of how it would unfold and how it would ultimately conclude. And so I set out to write that. And what I found was that each time I got to the next book, I started asking the same questions. What is new? What's fresh and new can I do in this world with these characters? And it usually centered around the locations that they would go to. And there's a lot of interesting locations at the end, everywhere from nuclear power plants to the White House to the Greenbrier, just all kinds of interesting settings, to the kind of people that they would encounter and some of the unique challenges that they would face. So it wasn't always just, I've got to go overcome this person who's in charge and doing bad things. But there were lots of unique challenges that maybe people don't think about, put them in a fresh sort of setting where they have to sort of imagine themselves being there. And so that's what I try and do. In each of the books, I think, okay, what's going to be completely new in this story? And each book has a completely different sort of setting and challenge. It has the same characters walking through it, but they all face different things each time.
I gotcha. What's the big takeaway from your series? What is the thing that you want readers to really get out of your books? Do you have a singular message?
Well, there are a few, I think, and in some of the books they're fairly clear. In one of the books, for example, in Anarchy Rising, which is the second book, the U.S. Marshal comes across the town that has essentially there's been sort of a dictator installed, a warlord of sorts. It's a woman, and she's pretty brutal to keep things under control. And what the message in the story ultimately is, as he sort of has to combat this situation, was that it's very easy to give away your freedoms. And in fact, that's what the people did in this town. They essentially surrendered their freedoms for security, but it's very difficult to take it back. And that's sort of the message that they have to work through, as he sort of gets them back on the right course and has to combat this sort of evil dictator of sorts. But there are other messages too. The characters in the story, the two different sets of characters are completely different. The Marshal, a lot of people compare him to like Raylan Givens on the Justified series, which I loved. So it probably influenced me. But he's this very sort of serious, but an honorable guy, not a guy that's gonna, the law is the law, and he's gonna enforce the law and hold people accountable. And the other side of it, his father is sort of this, much darker, much more willing to bend the rules however he needs to bend the rules to survive. And for example, there's a scene in one of the books where he comes across this man and son, who have a son being like around in his 20s, who have retreated to a bunker, but they ultimately decided they didn't want to be by themselves. So they kidnap a young woman, kill her boyfriend, and take her into this bunker with them. And she's mute. She can't speak. And so anyway, he finds these people and he manages to rescue the woman. He kills the father, and the boy being a 20-year-old is down in the bunker, and he gets the woman away from it. As he's heading out, he just sort of stops and tells her to hold on, and goes back and pours gasoline down in the bunker and burns the guy alive. And the message, I think, is that he has his own sense of justice, and his justice is not the same as the U.S. Marshals. And so I think people have to figure out where do they fall? Are were you more on the Tanner Rain, sort of this darker, I'll do what I have to do, or are you more of this honorable sort of lawman type? And it's funny because I hear split right down the middle almost daily. People will write and say, "Oh, I love Marshal Rains and his dog. It's great, I love it." And then the other half of the emails was saying, the Marshal's all right, but I really identify with Tanner and the young girl that's with him, Samantha, and what they have to go through and how he handles it. So it's kind of interesting. It seemed to have split the difference, and people find themselves in one camp or another.
Yeah, that's a pretty deep thing. I mean, I think that's something that not enough preppers wrestle with, as far as thinking through when things are really dark, how dark will they be? And I think that also kind of brings up for you personally, as you were writing these books, especially with a series, you're spending a lot of time in a really dark place, did end up influencing your own preparedness and maybe your own outlook on things?
It probably did. I wouldn't describe the world in which they live as dark, although it's kind of weird to say that because most everyone has died and there's, decaying bodies everywhere and they have all these terrible challenges they have to go through.
It's kind of dark.
I do try and it's a fun world. I mean, I don't want people to think it's not a dreary, sludge of like The Road, for example. If you read The Road, it's a very, if you've read that book, it's a very dreary sort of world to even read through. And mine is much more of a pulp fiction-y, the heroes are going to find their way through it. And there's good and there's bad. And I try and highlight and give credit to both. But it's not so much of a dark place as the scenario in which they're at. There's lots of unfortunate things have happened. But in terms of affecting me, I was very much into preparedness before I set out to write this. So I had a good base on which to draw, but I certainly, it had me, think through worst case scenarios. You start thinking, well, if I were in that situation, what would I make it out of that? And how would I do that? And I oftentimes put myself in the place of the characters in the story and think, what would I do? And what could go wrong? And, I try and sort of challenge myself to think through those events.
I gotcha. So let's move on to the lightning round. What is your prepper pet peeve? Something in the community that drives you nuts? A myth repeated over and over, or just something just plain and simple dumb?
So many myths. At least much of my time is spent talking about electromagnetic pulse attacks. And so I would guess I would have to say my pet peeves that I see most often are related to that. There are lots of people who have YouTube videos and websites and so forth that talk about EMPs that really don't have any real technical knowledge of what it is and how to protect against it. So I hear a lot, for example, about Faraday cages, which is really just a metallic enclosure, conductive enclosure, and whether or not you need to ground it and why you don't or you do. You don't, by the way, but there's a lot of sort of misinformation out there from people that don't fundamentally understand, electromagnetics, I guess, at its core. So that's probably my pet peeve. Although, to be fair, it's given me a voice in the community. I get to answer questions for people, and I go on a lot of different shows and a lot of different interviews and tell people about what really works and what doesn't work. And so I guess in that sense, maybe it's been a good thing.
Cool. So what is your long gun of choice? Are you an AK guy, an AR guy, a shotgun, or something more exotic and unusual?
Yeah, no, I'm an AR guy. I was in the Army, as I mentioned, so I grew up with the M16 in those days, and I got very familiar with that weapon. And of course, AR is so similar. So yeah, I have a couple of ARs myself. Cool.
What would you consider to be your singular most important piece of gear?
That's a tricky one. When I sort of preach preparedness as a whole, I sort of identify these 14 needs. Everybody has 14 needs, humans do. And I walk them through food, water, and you can go on down the list. And some people really focus on like protection as one of the needs. And they focus on, of course, their weapons. And I'm a big gun buff. I mean, I admit it. But I wouldn't say that's probably my single most important piece of gear. It's probably a good knife, to be honest. I don't go anywhere at all without a good knife. And it's just, it's one of those multi-purpose kinds of things that can save your life. You can do all kinds of things with a good knife. So I'd have to say that's probably my single piece of most important gear.
What would you say is the best $100 you've ever spent on preparedness?
Well, let's see. Best $100 I've ever spent on preparedness. I don't know. I can tell you the best $100 I've ever spent. It wouldn't be on preparedness though, but okay. It's a story we're sharing. So it's actually the best $100 I've never spent. It's $100 I should have spent that I did not. And it was when it's not relevant to preparedness, but it defines who I am a little bit. When I first went to college, my first day of class, I was supposed to buy the textbook for class, and I didn't buy it because I was a cheapskate, like a lot of college students. And I went to class without it. And the beautiful girl sitting at the front row had her textbook, so I sat beside her, thinking, well, I'll just flirt with the beautiful girl and share her textbook. And indeed, I did. I shared her textbook, and she was very sweet. And we ended up dating and later getting married, and she's my wife, and we have 4 kids. So $100 I didn't spend that probably was a fundamental decision in my life. So
yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. That makes sense. And, and if we consider, having offspring being one of the roots of survival as a species, I guess that did work out for you.
There you go.
There you go. So someone goes out, they buy your books, they decide, this Arthur guy, he is my brand of wacky. How can they connect with you and keep up with you, find out about new books and other projects you may be working on?
Of course, they can always search for books on all of the normal retailers, Amazon and stuff. But if they want to know about me and just sort of listen to samples of the books and that sort of thing, they can go to disasterprepper.com and learn all about me and the kind of things I say and do and write about.
So when they get to disasterprepper.com, what are all the different things they're going to find there?
Well, so they'll find a whole list of all the books, and there's audiobook samples for, I love audiobooks. When I travel, I love to listen to audiobooks. And so I have had all my books converted into audiobooks, all the fictional books. And so if there's audiobook listeners out there, the guy who reads it, a guy named John David Farrell, is great. He can pick up accents and all kinds of things to really make it seem like there's lots of characters in the story. So they can listen to little samples of that. They can certainly get some discounts on the books and like bulk packages and stuff. And then there's a lot of information on EMP preparedness. Over the years, there's been so many people needed this or needed that I started offering to sort of be the middleman on things. So I sell EMP bags and conductive cloth that you can use to cover either cars or generators, ferrites, other things like that related to protecting from an EMP. But more than anything else, there's just a lot of information there. It's all free. There's no advertisements for any other companies or anything. There's a mailing list you can click on to get my newsletter. I send a little newsletter out about every 3 or 4 months. And it just has preparedness tips in it. It's all free. And of course, it's to get people interested in the books. But in general, I try and roll in good, useful information into the newsletters. No spam. Nobody gets any spam from me or anything like that. So it's just kind of a general preparedness website that people can get information from.
Well, very cool. So tell us that website address one more time.
Sure. It's disasterprepper.com.
Awesome. Arthur, thank you so much for being on today, and hopefully we'll get you on again soon to talk about EMPs.
All right, great. Thanks for having me.
Show notes from this episode and other resources can be found by going to intherabbithole.com/E247. Support the show and get ITH Roving Horde Armada members-only benefits. Go to ithh.net to become part of the Roving Horde Armada. Twice a month, members get on a private virtual hang. These are a chance to hang out with me and other like-minded preppers to discuss whatever's on your mind. You can also get access to every episode of ITH ever made, the on-demand bug-out bag class, special prepper spreadsheets, and an invitation to the secret ITH Armada Facebook group. And that's just to name a few things you get when you go to ithh.net to become part of the Roving Horde Armada. Again, that's ithh.net to find out more about the exclusive members-only benefits and become part of the Roving Horde Armada. With that, we wrap up episode number 247 from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.